Hello and welcome to Chamber Conversations. My name is Rick Weldon. I'm the President and CEO of the Frederick County Chamber of Commerce. We've been bringing you these conversations as a way to keep us all connected during this time where we're so disconnected, and also to bring to you trusted advisors and subject matter experts on topics that are important all the time, but in many cases critically important during the time that we're in. It's my pleasure today to introduce to you our guest for this session, and that's Matt Johnston. Matt is an attorney here in Frederick County. Matt runs a really interesting law firm that caters to small business, to creative businesses, basically anybody that needs the kind of creative, forward-thinking legal advice that Matt gives. I got to know Matt through Leadership Frederick County. Matt is an alumni and one that we're very proud of. And it was during that year-long experience that I got to see and hear Matt interact with other people and share the kind of thoughtful, reasoned advice that Matt is known for. And that's why we asked him to join us today. So Matt, thank you very much for being with us on Chamber Conversations.
Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
It will be fun. So we start with the interesting environment that we find ourselves in, right? That you and I don't get to be sitting here in our boardroom having a conversation like we have in the past, that we have to do it by video. But, you know, it's just, and I think I said this with our other guests. So we've had Shabri Moore and Amanda Hadaway and Jason Lee. And I think I've started all these conversations with, it's never been more important to be connected to critical sources of information than it is right now. And I think it's going to be even more critical as we advance toward a point, hopefully in the near future, where businesses can get back to business again. But right now, I kind of want to focus on kind of where we are in the instability and the uncertainty, because for someone like you, being able to talk folks through at least a little bit of that uncertainty and to represent to them that there are people out here who have some advice to share and are happy to share it. I wanted to talk first about kind of employment law, right? So we've been through furloughs and layoffs and temporary displacements, and at some point we're going to be talking about bringing people back. But for right now, it's things like paid sick leave, family and medical leave, recent legislative enactions. Can you talk a little bit about that from the perspective of what a small employer is faced with?
So, yeah, I mean, probably the most difficult thing that small employers are faced with right now is just the massive uncertainty. You know what it's like to legislate in kind of an emergency situation. And yeah, Congress they're legislating, and the hard part about the legislation is that Congress doesn't write all of the detailed rules. That's left up to the agencies. And I know it's extraordinarily frustrating, things like, how does paid sick leave work? And how does that work with my paid time off policy? And things of that nature. And, these executive agencies, they are stuck in a situation where they have to create policy in a much shorter time frame than usual. And there's no notice and comment period, which is a common feature of regulatory action, which the notice and comment period allows people to say, well, what about this situation? And what about that situation? And that doesn't exist. So the guidance has a tendency to evolve over time. And the most important thing, I think, at this point for small employers to think about is, first of all, determine that, be aware that you are covered. Unless you employ more than 500 people, you're covered, and you have to then comply unless there's an exemption. And a lot of small businesses may be exempt because it's too expensive for them to provide a paid sick leave or the expanded FMLA that's available. So just a quick overview. The federal paid sick leave and the expanded FMLA apply only for COVID-19 related reasons. It's not, I have to have I have to have surgery or something like that, an elective surgery. These don't apply in those situations. It only applies to COVID-19 related things. So other than that, people are into their own their regular PTO, or they're taking unpaid leave. So it's a frustrating time for a lot of employers, and I get that. So.
Well, and we're going to revisit the statement I'm about to make a couple times this morning, and that's the concept of, so once we get through this, and hopefully it's just a couple more weeks, but it might be as much as a month. It's never been more important to understand the playing field that you operate on as a business owner, right? So, and we said this with Amanda, having an HR advisor consultant, it may seem like a large fixed expense for a small business. It's times like this that investment pays off. And the same is true with thoughtful legal counsel from an attorney who understands these mechanics. So I'm telling every nonprofit CEO out there, every small business owner and CEO, and certainly mid-size and larger, but they typically have legal counsel on staff or HR on staff. Take the time when you come back and reestablish operations to bring in those expert consultants to go through your employee handbook, your purchasing policy, your insurance obligations and commitments. Because right now I'm going to ask you about insurance. So I've been hearing, both through social media and through the inundation of email from our membership, the fact that people thought they were covered for business loss in this time, only to find out that national insurance companies who have a trusted local agent that the business felt protected by isn't going to cover their loss because it's a pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about that and how to, one, the exposure, and two, how to address the exposure?
So the exposure is essentially, it boils down to this. Unless your policy had an income replacement, so a loss of revenue that is tied to a pandemic or public health emergency, chances are you're not going to be covered. And most policies, because we haven't really had a massive loss of revenue or massive loss of economic activity because of a public health emergency in 100 years, most policies aren't going to cover that. And I know that is a decidedly disappointing at best situation. But most insurance companies are going to have a platoon of lawyers like me whose sole job is to get out of paying benefits and things like that. So they're going to really start to enforce the letter of that insurance contract. And so unless you had something like that, your chances are you're probably going to be out of luck. So what can you do going forward? Well, there is insurances. There are going to be products. If it's not available now, they will be available soon for most insurance carriers that will cover a loss of revenue or a partial loss of revenue related to a public health emergency where your operation is shut down. It's probably going to be a requirement that it be shut down by an order of the government. It can't be, my employees are scared to come in. It would have to be, you are deemed a non-essential industry, so you're not going to be open. And the loss of revenue may be limited to X number of dollars per day, some percentage of your provable income. I'm not sure how the actuaries are going to go about measuring that risk, but start working with your insurance agents, an insurance broker, finding out what some of the options are going to be. Some of them are going to be expensive and some of them not, and so you're just going to have to sort of figure out where you are. Certainly businesses that are going to be deemed, that are typically going to be deemed non-essential, you're going to pay a little bit more than you would if you were an essential business.
It's great advice, and the unique nature of this pandemic is that with the flu season reemergence in the fall, late fall, early winter, we could face this again, maybe not on the same scale. So when you are able to reestablish operation, just like we talked about with sort of HR legal crossroads, it'll be a really important time to look at things like loss of business income, or another issue that you had mentioned in our preamble to get ready for this was a force majeure clause, or something most people, honestly, except you, in your profession or underwriters, ever thought about. Now is the time.
Yeah, this is really the time to start thinking about a force majeure clause. So I don't like the word force majeure. It sounds a lot like a French boy band. So think about this as events beyond the control of the parties to the contract. That's essentially what we're talking about. And traditionally, this is just almost throwaway boilerplate provision that's usually buried at the back of a contract. And it usually covers things like fires, floods, earthquakes, natural disasters of a certain kind. Sometimes it covers governmental action, which is where a lot of the sort of questioning has come about now. Is a government order to shelter in place, is that a sufficient government action? I had a client who their business is putting on large events, conventions, and things like that. And one of them was out of state, but that state hadn't issued an order that banned events of more than 10 people. Or it hadn't at the time that we were dealing with this issue, but the state of Maryland had. And so we were trying to fight that sort of thing. And a force majeure clause that's a little bit more explicit, that deals with public health emergencies, partial government closings versus full government closings. It's going to take some work. And a force majeure clause that just simply says we don't have to perform if one of these things happen is not particularly helpful. Because for example, if you're a service provider and the force majeure kicks in, but you're still owed $6,000 for work that you already did before, if you say you don't have to perform, do you still get that $6,000? Well, that's a real important question. And so the force majeure clause has to not only cover what events are outside the party's control, but what is going to be the action going forward. Are we going to have a discussion? Is activity before a declaration or before a fire still compensable? What about deliverables? All of those sorts of things should be considered in a force majeure clause. And until now, most people, and including people in my profession, just sort of like, it's okay. Yeah, it's fine. The standard language is okay. Well, it's not really going to be okay anymore. And it's really going to depend upon the nature of the business that you're in, the customers that you have, the transactions that are being engaged in. And if you engage in multiple sort of business lines, you may have a different force majeure clause based upon the particular transaction.
Yeah. So again, these are things that we haven't given a lot of thought to beforehand. This interval, it could even be the eye of the hurricane, right? The relief that we get when we're able to come back on a limited basis with expanded testing and contact tracing. But take that time to not celebrate reopening, but to think about the fact that these terrible lessons that we've learned at great expense are things we may have to deal with again, and potentially even in a relatively short term if no vaccine, no therapies have cleared the FDA process and the virus reemerges when flu season kicks in again. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is, even if you're shut down, even if you're a business that is deemed non-essential, this is time to start revisiting those things. This is a time to huddle together with your advisors, your professional advisors, outside advisors, mentors, and things like that, and start working through these processes. Think about what if we have to go into another shutdown? think about how do I manage employees if we have to go into another shutdown or we have to limit activity. This is a really, really good time to consider those things that may not require a great deal of action, but is a really good skull session type of conversation to be having. And, you know, you can do it by Zoom. You can do it by, you know, exchanging emails and things like that. It doesn't have to be some grand, expensive operational output. It can be just a series of conversations and some, you know, sketching some ideas out and working from that point of view.
So we're going to need to do another session with you, because I really do want to talk about telework pitfalls, and you've got some really valuable information that's available to your clients that you've already put up on your website about sort of things to think about with teleworking. And we might have to do, because we're approaching the end of our 15 minutes together, but let me just get you to talk for a minute as we wrap up about the critical importance of that relationship with a subject matter expert, right? So it's critically important today, and it's going to be critically important, like I said, in the short term as we prepare to come back. But you've taught me, Amanda has taught me, Brett Hess at BMC, Jason Lee, you people have taught me the obligation I have as the leader of an organization to protect my business model, my most treasured resource, which is our employees, in our case, and our members. Can you just talk for a minute about the criticality of that relationship, maybe without disclosing a client, talk about things you've been able to do to help a client to kind of cement in people's minds why establishing these relationships is so critically important?
Sure. Most small business owners, they're operating by themselves. Even in the case of you and the chamber staff, there is the possibility of getting sort of isolated in your thinking. You guys don't have a big team, but there is a team there. And establishing a relationship with people who are outside the organization but have a vested interest in your organization's success, they bring different ideas to the table. So I can work with a client, like I have a particular client had to lay off the entire staff. Really had no choice. There was not going to be any revenue. And this particular business owner has taken the opportunity to really pivot how they're going to go about running their business, the kind of work that they're going to do, largely because they didn't have this opportunity before. And it means having a relationship with an attorney, with an accountant, with a mentor, with an insurance broker, a banker, these kinds of folks, gives you the opportunity to run ideas by somebody and say, what do you think? And, you know, I represent people in a variety of different industries, and I can pick and choose to say, well, this client over here is doing this. It may be applicable. Yeah, it's a totally different industry, but it's maybe applicable to what you're trying to do and how you're doing it. And having access to people who are outside that normal circle of day-to-day operations gives you that input that you may need. Some of it's required. I mean, you know, working with an accountant, you're going to need to know what I want to do X. What's the impact on my tax picture, my financial picture? A lawyer, I want to do X. Well, okay, let's think about this and let's think about that. And you have to comply with these sorts of things if you want to go that direction, but you don't have to do it if you do this direction. Having that different input is ultimately the purpose of the relationships. The actual mechanism, me rendering legal advice, that's the actual mechanism. But the purpose of it is to put a business owner in a place where they can take advice from well outside their normal circle of competence and expand their circle a little bit, and then be able to make better decisions and move forward with some confidence that there's going to be somebody around to say, okay, maybe you need to think about this.
Yeah.
And I think it works.
So if I'm out there and I'm watching this, and I know Rick's going to reschedule Matt for a future session to talk about telework and a couple other things, but I want to reach out to Matt. So the way to do that is your website is johnston-legal.com. So that's JOHNSTON-LEGAL.com, johnston-legal.com, or it's matt@johnstonlegal.com.
Or actually, there's an easier way to remember the website. It's mattthelawyer, all one word, .com.
That works.
Nice and easy. So you don't have to worry about the little dash or anything like that. mattthelawyer.com.
If you don't want to wait till the next time we can get rescheduled out there, hit mattthelawyer.com with your questions, and we're definitely going to key you up again in a couple weeks, Matt, so we can go through some of these other topics, because I think this stuff is just invaluable. Certainly going to be important as we start bringing people back.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for your time. I consider you one of my trusted advisors, which is why you were one of the first chamber conversations. I look forward to having this conversation with you again. Thanks, Matt.
Cool.